In this lesson, we're going to navigate over to the LawHub and discuss how to engage with a dual passage reading comprehension set from the reading comprehension section of the LSAT. So we're going to head right over to lawhub.lsac.org and we're going to sign in because I believe that I'm not signed in, but we're going to hit LSAT prep. Actually, I am signed in, so it's going to work just fine. And we're going to go back to drill set number 1 for the reading comprehension. We're going to hit new drill set, even though we've gone through some of these other questions from the other passage in our prior videos. Here we're going to focus just on question 8 and beyond. And the way that we do this is still going to be the same as we did with a single passage structure. We're going to go and focus on highlighting the main ideas for the passages first before engaging the question tasks. So we're going to select our highlight tool. And remember that on the official LSAT and the full prep test, you'll be able to use the passage only view, but here we're just going to have to scroll. So for that reason, I'm going to scroll down just a little bit and frame up passage A. And we're going to read the first paragraph before considering what the main idea sentence of that paragraph is. So, a truly democratic electoral system will tend to produce governments that are equitable and responsive to all sections of the electorate, as well as stable and effective. In electoral systems that force each party to seek votes from all sections of the electorate, the party's policies increasingly converge, and this broadens popular consensus around government policies. The result is an equitable government responsive to all interests. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, that's pretty dense. How am I going to highlight just one sentence? Well, you can take a glance at the following paragraph to see where the narrative goes. And we see at the topic sentence of the beginning of the second paragraph, we're referencing several non-majority political parties. So we want to focus on the sentence in paragraph 1 that involves the parties. So we're going to highlight this: in electoral systems that force each party to seek votes from all sections of the electorate, the party's policies increasingly converge, and this broadens popular consensus around government policies. And you might go ahead and highlight that final short sentence as well. It doesn't really take too much more to read. And just broadly, because the dual passages tend to be so dense, you may actually end up with a little bit of leeway beyond that 2-sentence maximum per paragraph that we apply to a single passage in the reading comprehensions paragraphs. So looking at the second paragraph, where there are several non-majority political parties, as in some modern parliamentary democracies, it often occurs that a few parties form a coalition to produce the overall majority needed to govern. The electorate gets wide representation in government, but this does not ensure equitable policy outcomes. Thus, where there are 3 or 4 parties, each primarily responsive to a different population segment, parties will tend to diverge in policy even in coalition governments. The fact that a particular small segment is represented in the legislature by its own party, perhaps even proportionally to votes gained, generally does not produce government policies responsive to that segment's interests. So here we've got the indicator term of thus. I might not highlight the thus just because it'd be a strange transition from the pink highlights for the first paragraph, but I'm certainly going to want to pick up these final 2 sentences as the main idea sentences for this second paragraph. Then we conclude the chances of having equitable government are increased by electoral systems that produce convergence in policy among parties. Furthermore, the more similar the parties are, the more easily a coalition can be formed and the more stable it will be, since there will be less disruption when, after an election, a former opposition party enters government. And we know that we're focused on this idea of parties, and we'll just highlight this first sentence, understanding that the furthermore statement is just extra. And if we need to go get that, we will. But these highlights in pink probably will satisfy our need to summarize the narrative. And because we've got 2 passages, we're not going to reread now, but we do know that the issue of party representation is going to in some way be referenced in passage B, and we'll scroll down there now. So we'll want to be focused on that same general subject matter, understanding that passage B has to build on what we read in passage A. So To start the first paragraph of passage B, the electoral system of proportional representation, or PR, is a good solution to two problems affecting some democracies: that most adults do not regularly vote, and that when they do, they have extremely limited policy choices. The PR principle, in essence, is that parties or blocs of like minded voters should win seats in proportion to their share of the popular vote. In PR systems, voters in each electoral district or constituency are represented by several elected officials rather than just one, as in the winner take all one seat district system used in many places. Winner take all systems allow 51% of voters to win 100% of representation. In contrast, PR ensures that voters in the majority will earn a majority of seats, but voters in the minority also will earn their fair share of representation. Under PR, a party that wins 10% of the popular vote becomes critically significant, not as in winner take all elections, virtually irrelevant. So the main idea sentence here should be relatively apparent, and it's that opening statement, which is the author of Passage B's recommendation that PR is a good solution to the problems affecting democracy. And we should note, as we're reading, that this is in contrast to the first passage's author, Passage A, who was in favor of thinking about the convergence of parties around policy as opposed to having this sort of proportional representation. And you might decide that you want a second sentence. It really doesn't matter all that much which sentence you choose. And that's kind of something to have in mind as you're highlighting. There isn't necessarily a one size fits all highlight. You just have to make sure that you've got an overall narrative that captures the big picture. And I would say that if we just highlight this final sentence of the first paragraph of passage B, we get that overall narrative pretty well. So we'll continue. In a winner take all system, political candidates who try to provide alternatives to the dominant parties are usually ignored because winning 10% of the vote makes them at best spoilers. Where a few parties are dominant, non majority parties are trapped in a vicious cycle of marginalization. Many potential supporters will not want to waste their votes on sure losers and will vote instead for the candidate that they deem electable and least likely to significantly harm their interests. PR, on the other hand, would allow people to vote their views, not their fears, thereby breaking majoritarian parties' stranglehold on representation. And we basically have the summary statement of passage B in this final sentence. You can see I skipped over the on the other hand just to maintain my narrative overall. And it's kind of, again, at your discretion whether you want to grab an extra sentence to just build on that narrative. There's not really a right or wrong answer, but we'll go ahead and grab this second sentence as well just to have a little bit more surrounding context. So if we read from the top at this point, we want to make sure that we've got the overall narrative for both passages and kind of relate them to each other. So we'll read once through with the pink. In electoral systems that force each party to seek votes from all sections of the electorate, the party's policies increasingly converge, and this broadens popular consensus around government policies. The result is an equitable government responsive to all interests. Where there are three or four parties, each primarily responsive to a different population segment, parties will tend to diverge in policy even in coalition governments. The fact that a particular small segment is represented in the legislature by its own party, perhaps even proportionally to votes gained, generally does not produce government policies responsive to that segment's interests. The chances of having equitable government are increased by electoral systems that produce convergence in policy among parties. The electoral system of proportional representation, or PR, is a good solution to two problems affecting some democracies: that most adults do not regularly vote, and that when they do, they have extremely limited policy choices. Under PR, a party that wins 10% of the popular vote becomes critically significant, not as in winner take all elections, virtually irrelevant. Where a few parties are dominant, non majority parties are trapped in a vicious cycle of marginalization. Many potential supporters will not want to waste their votes on sure losers and will vote instead for the candidate that they deem electable and least likely to significantly harm their interests. PR would allow people to vote their views, not their fears, thereby breaking majoritarian party stranglehold on representation. And we should have a general idea that Passage A is interested in basically a winner take all convergence of the parties around policy positions. Whereas Passage B says that this proportional representation, or PR, whereby you get minority parties with a little bit more representation, is a better approach. So we've got that in mind as we move to question 8, and we'll highlight the whole thing because we're just having a pretty straightforward upfront, what is the main concern of both passages kind of question. And when it asks it in this phrasing of which of the following questions are the passages concerned with, it's really just a different way of asking what is the main idea. So, choice A, what democratic electoral model enables the fairest representation of a politically diverse electorate? It's a relatively anodyne, bland kind of phrasing, but we're definitely talking about whether we should have winner take all or proportional representation. So if you recognize it, A seems pretty good at this point. And if we like A, we could go briskly through the remaining answer choices and eliminate as soon as we find something that we can highlight as distinctively incorrect. So, choice B, what democratic social practices? I don't know anything about social practices. So, we'll just highlight democratic social practices and eliminate choice B at this point. Then we've got choice C. How is it possible to reconcile the need for widespread participation in democratic elections with the assumption that people should not be coerced into political participation? Well, we didn't talk about any coercion of these people or these voters, so can eliminate choice C immediately as well. Then choice D, how can a coalition of political parties with divergent interests govern effectively if none of those parties is supported by a majority of the electorate? Well, the authors didn't state that there couldn't be any majority, so choice D is out. And then lastly, choice E, how can a political party promote the interests of a majority of voters without alienating voters who have interests that are antithetical to those of the majority? Well, there's a couple of very extreme kind of statements and terms in choice E, so we can eliminate for that reason there. And this is how you can address the overall main idea of each of the passages. And for most, if not all, of the dual passage reading comprehension sets, the majority of the questions are actually going to be main idea questions asking about one of the passages or both of the passages. So we're going to try to address the rest of these questions in this video as well without necessarily rereading a whole heck of a lot. So let's continue to question 9. And it reads, the author of passage A would most likely hold which one of the following views regarding a system that strictly adheres to the PR principle as it is characterized in passage B. So we'll just highlight this bit here, and you want to predict in your own mind. And you might recall that passage A was for the winner take all, and passage B was for the proportional representation. So we're going to look for something that says A wouldn't necessarily agree with proportional representation. So choice A, it is as close an approximation to what a true democracy should be. Oh, no, the author of passage A wouldn't agree with the PR option. So we'll eliminate choice A at this point. Then choice B, it will not produce government that is as responsive to all interests as should be in the case in a true democracy. Well, at least this is anti-PR, so let's just leave open B, even though it might not jump out as correct as readily as what we just saw in question 8. Then we've got choice C. It will lead to convergence of the policies of the various political parties, broadening the popular consensus around government policies. This is positive. We know that is a reversal. Then choice D. Although it will likely produce an equitable government, well, it's not going to produce an equitable government. We just established that the author of A is not in favor of PR producing an equitable government, so we will block out choice D as well. And then it will produce a more equitable, stable, and effective government. Well, no, this again is backwards. So you can see most of the answer choices are backwards, except for the correct answer of B. And we can select that without even necessarily going back into the passage we just read. So let's move on to the next question, number 10. And we've got which of the following is most strongly supported by information given in both passages? Now, what you don't want to do is go try and hunt and peck. We're going to treat this like a hidden main idea as well and eliminate answer choices that we know aren't matching the idea that passage A is kind of against proportional representation and passage B is for it. So choice A, where there are two dominant parties in a democracy with a PR electoral system, there tends to be more convergence in policy between them than there tends to be between two dominant parties in a democracy without PR electoral system. This is actually the primary point at issue. And it's kind of the whole thing that's wrong here, but I might just highlight part of it to say that I evaluated this and know why it's wrong. It's basically 100% or 180 degrees backwards. Then we've got choice B. In democracies with PR electoral systems, no one party can succeed in having a large number of its candidates elected. Well, no, you could get to a majority. It's just that the majority doesn't dictate everything. So we can eliminate choice B for that. Then choice C, smaller political parties in democracies tend to be more responsive to their supporters' interests than larger political parties tend to be to their own supporters' interests. Again, this is actually the point at issue. It's not that they agree on this fact. So we'd eliminate choice C as something they would probably disagree about. And then choice D, electoral systems that allow 51% of voters to win 100% of representation are not electoral systems that produce convergence in policies among all political parties. Well, this part about 51% of voters goes directly against what's happening in choice A. Because choice A says that you would get that, or passage A would say that you would get that kind of convergence. So we'll eliminate choice D. And lastly, choice E, policy debates are likely to be more highly contentious in PR electoral systems than in winner take all systems. Well, that's the issue for passage A because we get convergence among the parties without the proportional representation. And in passage B, we get more representation for the minority position. So you're still going to have greater representation by the minorities. So each of the two passage authors would agree that choice E is true because it focuses on the idea that the proportional representation increases the amount of differing opinions that you'll have in the governing body. So next, we'll move to number 11. Again, it's just a variation on a main idea task. We're being asked what is true of the relationship between passage A and passage B. Well, if we look at choice A, passage B rejects the conclusion reached in passage A. Well, yeah, that's everything that we've been talking about. And again, if you recognize that this is right, you could move briskly through everything at the end. So then the disciplines from which the evidence presented in the passages is drawn are different. Well, we don't even really have evidence anywhere in either of the passages. And to say that they're different, like disciplines, like one's an economist and one's a historian, we don't know that. So we eliminate choice B readily. Then choice C, passage A is mainly devoted to discussing some of the presuppositions of a theory that is discussed in passage B. Well, A isn't mainly devoted to discussing the assumptions of the proportional representation theory, so we'll eliminate C. Then with D, we've got passage A is mainly devoted to setting out a general principle, some exceptions to which are discussed in passage B. Well, passage B presents an entirely different principle, not just some exceptions to what was discussed about the convergence of the parties in passage A. And then lastly, choice E, the questions primarily discussed in passage B are more general than those primarily discussed in passage A. There's not really a difference in generality in the two passages. They're both relatively high level, so we can eliminate E, and the correct answer in this case would be choice A. And we move on to our last question for this relatively short 5-question dual passage setup. And once again, it's really just another big picture main idea task question. So, which of the following is a principle that is expressed in one of the passages and would most likely be accepted by the author of the other passage? So, we're looking for something that is stated in one of the passages. And the opposition, because they are kind of oppositional, as we've established at this point, would agree with that still. So, choice A, voters in each district or constituency should be represented by several elected officials rather than just one. Again, this is the point at issue because we know that there might be multiple people representing in the PR structure, but there might just be one in the passage A, kind of more winner take all structure. So we can eliminate choice A for that. Next, choice B, the chances of having equitable government are greater in electoral systems that produce convergence in policy among all parties. Again, that's what A would agree with, would state, but B wouldn't agree with it. So producing convergence among all parties isn't what B is advocating. So we can eliminate choice B for that reason. Choice C, democratic systems in which a few parties are dominant cause smaller alternative parties to become trapped in a vicious cycle of marginalization. Well, this is a trap because we probably remember that phrase, vicious cycle of marginalization, for passage B, but passage A wouldn't agree with this. So we'd eliminate choice C. And then choice D, Democratic electoral systems should tend to produce governments that are responsive to all sections of the electorate. That's exactly what they would both agree with. They just disagree about how to get there. So we might highlight responsive to all sections of the electorate and say that's why choice D is correct. And lastly, choice E, winner take all electoral systems are incompatible with the goal of achieving policy convergence among all political parties. Well, again, this is actually the point that's at issue. So while B might say that, A wouldn't agree with it. So we'd eliminate that answer choice. Now, remember, you do have these hints in the bottom. If you want to take a look at them, you can take a look at some of the tips, strategies, and related content. You also could go to the answer hints. They will ask you if you really want to do it. So you could decide when you're doing your own practice. And of course, you can also select show answer and they'll tell you, do you really want to do it? And you'll hit continue and you can see the answer as well.